The destruction of the Israelite kingdoms were events with both historical and spiritual significance. Historical significance because the fall of these nations was strongly linked to the politics of the Middle East, and the repercussions of these events continue to this very day. Spiritually significant because the events led to dramatic changes in the way that the Hebrews related to their God. In fact, it would be fair to say that the destruction of Judah and the exile that followed were the primary driving forces that led to the shift from the Yahwistic religion of the Old Testament to the Jewish faith of the intertestamental and New Testament eras. In the Bible, both the historical and spiritual aspects of the falls are discussed, but as always, Scripture puts the emphasis on the spiritual aspects. Very briefly, let's summarize the history of Israel leading up to the fall as it's told in the Bible. The Israelite kingdom came into existence around 1050 BC, when the Hebrew people, who had been led by judges since the days of Joshua, demanded a king. The first king, Saul, was disobedient to God, and so the kingdom was taken away from him and given to David. God promised David to establish his dynasty perpetually. When David died, his son Solomon succeeded him. Solomon was renowned for his wisdom and his riches, and he engaged in many building projects, including the creation of the Israelite temple in Jerusalem. But because of Solomon's worship of pagan gods, the Lord judged the nation by splitting it into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom Judah, after Solomon had died. In Judah, the descendants of King David continued to rule. In the northern kingdom, however, there was a succession of dynasties, and typically the dynastic changes occurred in bloody coups. The first king of the north, Jeroboam, established shrines in the northern city of Dan and in the southern city of Bethel. These shrines were a source of some consternation to the Lord because they featured a golden calf, an animal that was typically associated with the worship of the pagan god Baal. The northern kingdom, Israel, was bigger, wealthier, and more cosmopolitan than its southern neighbor. On the surface, that would seem to be a good thing, but in fact it caused a lot of trouble. To maintain its position of prosperity, Israel had to be either in alliance with its neighbors, or it had to be stronger than its neighbors. Israel formed close political bonds with the Phoenicians in the west, providing the kingdom with access to trade routes and to the sea. But this alliance also encouraged a cultural exchange that brought elements of Canaanite paganism into Israel's worship. In the 9th century BC, the Phoenician princess and pagan priestess Jezebel became queen of Israel through a marriage alliance with King Ahab, and she zealously attempted to introduce the worship of her gods into Israel. Prophets like Elijah and later Amos and Hosea fought a constant battle against idolatry and social injustice in the northern kingdom. Israel was frequently embroiled in conflicts with its neighbors, including the Moabites in the east and even Judah to the south. But one of its greatest rivals was Damascus, the capital of Syria in the north. The Syrians were sometimes the enemies of Israel, but occasionally the kingdoms would form alliances against common foes. In the 9th century BC, the Mesopotamian kingdom of Assyria began to expand into the south. Israel's first clash with Assyria occurred in 853 BC, when King Ahab joined in a coalition that seemed to keep the Assyrian aggression at bay for a while. Israel entered into an alliance with Assyria a decade later, apparently to assure their own protection against the aggressions of the Syrians. The struggles between Assyria, Damascus, and Israel continued on for a century, at times even dragging Judah into the mix. But from the late 9th century through the 8th century BC, Assyria was the great power in the Near East, and at various times both Israel and Judah were forced to pay them heavy tribute. Eventually, Israel decided it had paid enough to the greedy Assyrians. Around 732 BC, Israel, encouraged by the Pharaoh of Egypt, entered into an alliance with the Syrians and rebelled against Assyria. They even attempted to force Judah to join the alliance. When King Ahaz of Judah refused and requested aid from the Assyrians, the Assyrian armies invaded Syria and Israel with the intention of making an example of them. Damascus was destroyed, and Syria was annexed to the Assyrian Empire. Israel was severely crippled in this process, but the kingdom quickly recovered. In 722 BC, Israel rebelled yet again against Assyria. But this time, the Assyrians were much more thorough than they had been the last time. Israel's major cities were destroyed, including its capital in Samaria. The Assyrians deported the people from their land as captives. Assyria's policy with rebellious vassal nations was to scatter their inhabitants so they could no longer be a threat. The Israelites now suffered that very fate, being resettled in small villages and enclaves around the Assyrian Empire. But the land was not left empty. Israel was repopulated with people taken from other regions of the Assyrian Empire. These people were introduced to the religion of Israel by a priest from Judah, but for many decades they retained some of their former pagan ways. Eventually, however, these people became known as the Samaritans, from the name of the ancient capital of Israel, Samaria. Now Judah experienced its own problems with Assyria. In 701 BC, King Hezekiah attempted to rebel against the Assyrians, hoping once again for some aid from Egypt. Egypt, however, failed to deliver the kind of aid that Hezekiah was expecting. Judah was besieged and several cities were destroyed. The Bible records that when the Assyrian king Sennacherib mocked the God of Israel, Hezekiah and all the people appealed to the Lord for deliverance. God struck the Assyrian army with a plague, and Sennacherib had to withdraw. Jerusalem, however, resumed its tribute payments and became once again a loyal Assyrian vassal. After Hezekiah died in around 687 BC, Judah passed into the hands of his son Manasseh. This development would prove disastrous. Although it appears to have been a fairly prosperous time for Judah, with the Assyrians distracted temporarily by internal struggles, it was an era of spiritual apostasy. Manasseh proved to be the wickedest king ever to reign in Judah, instituting idolatry, injustices, and even child sacrifice as standard operating procedures. According to the Bible, it was at this time that God determined that Judah would suffer the same fate as Israel, going into exile. But Judah got a temporary reprieve. Manasseh's grandson, Josiah, who became king at the tender age of 8, proved to be the opposite of his grandfather. King Josiah instituted religious reforms as well as political reforms. He did away with public idolatry, and he managed to expand the kingdom by reconquering some of the lands that had formerly been held by Judah. In 620 BC, during renovations of the neglected Temple of Solomon, a law scroll was discovered that would become the centerpiece of Josiah's subsequent reform program. Based on this scroll, Josiah redoubled his efforts and instituted a controversial program that would require that all sacrifices would be performed only in Jerusalem, under the watchful eye of Orthodox priests. But Josiah's revival was short-lived. In 609 BC, Josiah was killed in the Battle of Megiddo, where he tried to prevent the advance of Egyptian troops led by Pharaoh Necho, who were on their way to aid the Assyrians in war against Babylon. Josiah's son Jehoahaz became king, but his reign proved short. When Necho returned from Mesopotamia, he removed Jehoahaz from the throne and replaced him with his brother Jehoiakim. Judah was now a vassal of Egypt. It wasn't long, however, before Jehoiakim had new overlords. After the Babylonians had defeated the Assyrians, they went on to push the Egyptians out of Palestine. In 605 BC, Judah became part of the Babylonian Empire. In some ways, Babylonian rule was an improvement over some of the previous regimes, because King Nebuchadnezzar believed that it was easier to rule an empire that did not hate him. So he actually attempted to enact some policies that benefited his vassals. The kingdoms of Palestine, however, were not impressed by his generous spirit. In 601 BC, King Jehoiakim of Judah rebelled against Babylon, hoping to break free from the empire with Egyptian aid. Egypt, however, once again failed to provide assistance, and in 597, Judah was invaded. Jehoiakim died during this time, perhaps due to an assassination, and his son Jehoiakim was made king. Jehoiakim soon surrendered to the Babylonians. He and many other prominent citizens of Jerusalem were taken to Babylon as hostages. His uncle Zedekiah was placed on the throne in his place. Zedekiah proved to be no less rebellious than Jehoiakim had been. In 587 BC, he too conspired to break away from Babylon. Once again, however, Judah's allies failed to provide the needed support. Babylon attacked Jerusalem and laid siege to the city, and this time Nebuchadnezzar was not inclined toward mercy. After a drawn-out siege, the Babylonians broke through the city gates. The palace and the temple of Solomon were destroyed. Zedekiah's children were killed before his eyes, before the king was blinded. Then he was taken to Babylon, where he was publicly executed. Thousands of the leading residents of Judah were taken away to Babylon with him. Judah was placed under the command of a native governor, but its days as a monarchy were over. The Babylonian exile, as it's called, lasted until 538 BC, when the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persians. King Cyrus of Persia issued a decree permitting the Judean captives to return home and rebuild their land. Most of them, however, chose to remain in Babylon, where they had been living for a generation. Their time in Babylon had made a deep impression on the people of Judah. They had adopted the Aramaic language of their overlords as their own. They had expanded their vision of the world, becoming a more cosmopolitan people. But most important of all were the changes to their religion. The flirtation with idolatry was mostly past. The people of Judah had generally adopted the idea that there was but one true God, and that He alone would they worship. And furthermore, the focus of their religion had shifted away from the temple, which had been destroyed, to the written scriptures which they had carried with them to Babylon. Though they would soon rebuild the temple and resume their sacrificial cult, it would no longer hold such a prominent place in the Hebrews' religion. The Judeans, through the process of exile, had become the people of the book.